River of Words program. I'm Alana Adams at the Art Center of Coastal Carolina, and I'm so glad to have you joining me for today's project. In each one of these River of Words lessons, we're going to have fun creating an original artwork while we learn about the plants, animals, and unique characteristics of our watershed here in the low country of South Carolina. Each of the lessons also has a PDF lesson plan that you can download to follow along and see all of the resources that I'm mentioning throughout the lesson. In the back of the packet, there's an appendix that usually has lots of fun pictures that you can use as inspiration for your project, as well as some really cool scientific information about food chains or the ecosystem that we're learning about in that lesson. Let's get started. For today's lesson, we're going to be making a creative collage of a shorebird or seabird that can be found along the shores of Beaufort County, South Carolina. Now, in the beginning of your lesson plan, there's a material sheet, but I'm going to go ahead and go over that for you now so you know what to have on hand as we start our project. We're going to be making a collage, so we're going to want lots of different types of paper for our collage to create interest. You can use things such as newspaper. I've got an old piece of sheet music in my box, some torn pages from magazines that have different colors, so a variety of those. I've got some old scrapbook paper from some old scrapbooking projects in here. And then we're also going to be creating our own texture rubbing paper today that we're going to incorporate in the collage. So for that, you're just going to need some regular white, like copy paper. You could even use notebook paper or whatever you have on hand. You'll want some crayons that have the paper already peeled off of them. That makes it easier for rubbing. And then a few different things that have texture. Texture is when we rub our finger on something and we can feel a bumpy surface. I found a piece of packing paper. This is like a corrugated kind of little piece of cardboard that might work well. You could also use produce bags and things like that from the kitchen. I've got a little piece of netting here that came from a small toy. And I also found at the dollar store some rubbing plates, and these are actually little squares of plastic that have texture on them that work great for texture rubbings. So even the concrete floor, if it's got a texture when you rub it, it will work for your texture rubbings today. And then you're going to want a piece of art paper that's maybe 8 by 10 or 9 by 12 size. This is going to be the paper that we create our artwork on. You can even use the back of a cereal box for this. If you don't have art paper, you just want something a little bit sturdier than copy paper since we're going to be putting lots of glue on it. You'll want a pencil so that you can create your sketch. Now you're going to need a picture of a shorebird or a seabird from South Carolina to use as your inspiration. As I mentioned before, you can find lots of information about that in the appendix in the back of the lesson plan packet. So you might choose a killdeer, or you might choose a brown pelican, or a seagull, or a white ibis. We've got lots of beautiful birds here in Beaufort County, South Carolina to choose from. So you'll just want a picture that kind of has the animal big on the page where you can see where the color changes shift and you can get a good glimpse at the shape of the bird that you're going to be making today. You may want some scissors. You can always create a collage by tearing paper, but if you'd like to have some scissors on hand, that wouldn't be a bad idea. And then you'll need a glue stick or some glue for your collage for gluing down the pieces of paper to your substrate or your background. The last thing some people like to have on hand is either some oil pastels or some crayons if you want to go back and add any additional color to create a contrast in the picture when we're finished. And I'll demonstrate all of that for you there at the end of the project. So step one for this project is we're going to create some texture rubbings. So I want you to go ahead and get out your crayons that don't have any paper on them, your lightweight paper, and all the items that you found that were bumpy. Again, you could even go outside, lay the paper on the driveway, or find leaves from nature, anything that has a bumpy surface. But what you'll do to create your texture rubbings is you'll take whatever the surface is that's bumpy, and you're going to lay your white paper or your copy paper, notebook paper, whatever lightweight paper you have on top, and your crayon, you're going to work with it laying down on its side. So again, that's why we don't want it to have any paper on it. And we're just going to rub back and forth. As you're rubbing and giving it a good bit of pressure, the texture from the surface below is showing up on your paper. Sometimes people have done this with coins or leaves from outside, as I mentioned. Anything that has a bumpy surface will work for this. We're not really thinking about the texture of our bird just yet. We're not really trying to create anything that will look like a feather texture necessarily. Any kind of texture will do. But you do want to go ahead and start thinking about the colors that are going to be in your collage. And most of our birds have a lot of earth tones. So I'm going to make sure that I am using lots of browns and blacks and things like that, some kind of more neutral colors as I'm creating my texture rubbings. You may decide that you want for your bird collage to be in bright colors that aren't even the realistic colors of the bird. That's totally up to you as the artist. Just take that into consideration as you're rubbing. Now another thing you can do is put two textures on top of each other. So I can even swap out that one with my bag from my lemons here, and right in the same spot where I had the previous texture, I'm going to rub a second layer of texture on top of that. That's going to create even more interest. You can do this over and over and over again. You don't have to do a whole sheet of paper in each texture. You might just want to do maybe half and half or a fourth of the paper in each texture. You're just giving yourself something to work with so that you can cut little bits and pieces or tear bits and pieces to get the color that you want in your collage. So go ahead and fill up 2 or 3 sheets of paper with some different texture rubbings, and then meet me back here and we'll go forward with the next step of our collage. You're going to want to go ahead and have your picture of your bird ready when you come back. So for this next step, we're going to go ahead and sketch out the shorebird or seabird that we're going to be working with today. So as I've mentioned, you're going to need a photograph or a printout of the bird. I've chosen a brown pelican. Now you want to take your paper, again this can be a heavy piece of art paper, or it could even be the back of a cereal box, a piece of cardboard, anything that's a little bit sturdier. And you want to go ahead and turn it in the orientation of your bird. Sometimes it makes sense to have it going up and down like mine. We call that the portrait orientation. Or sometimes your bird picture might go side to side and you'll want to turn your white paper side to side, and we call that the landscape orientation. So the first thing that I have done is turned my paper up in the portrait orientation, and I'm going to get out my pencil. And I always want to make sure that everyone understands the difference in sketching and drawing. When we first start in artwork, we usually want to use a technique called sketching, and that's where we're using very gentle pressure with the tip of our pencil so that we can erase and make changes as we go. If you push really hard, it kind of makes a mark that you can never get all the way erased. So we want to kind of sketch out the shape of the bird here on your paper. You want to make sure that it's large, because when you're dealing with collage and bits of torn and cut paper, it's hard to get all those tiny little details. So as I'm sketching my brown pelican pretty large on my paper here, I'm first wanting to just make sure that I'm getting the outside shape of the bird. And after I get the outside shape of the bird, the next important thing is that I am going to be looking at areas where the colors shift or change on the bird. Now, most birds have the same body parts, right? They all have wings, and they all have 2 legs and tails and beaks. But as you know, birds are very, very different from one another, different species. These 2 birds have a lot of things in common, the same body parts, but they have a lot of things that are different as well. So I want you to take a look. The little pelican that we have here, he's got a really big, long beak. And when I look at my seagull, he's got just a very short beak, right? Sometimes the beaks are really straight. Sometimes the beak is a little bit curved. So sometimes the legs are long and skinny. Sometimes they're short and broad. So I want you, as you're sketching your bird, to really pay attention to the proportion of the features of your bird. Does it have a really long tail, or does it have a short tail? What are the legs like? So this is going to be the part where you really want to take your time. You don't need to be adding a lot of details right now, because we're going to be putting paper on top of all this with our collage. But you do want to pay attention to the form or the shape of your bird, the proportion between the different parts. So I noticed that on my pelican that his beak is super long. It comes all the way down past where the neck ends, all the way down into this space. So I can watch with my eye this negative space right here, and I can really try to make sure I capture that in my sketch. That's going to help you a lot to make sure that your species is recognizable as being unique and different from the other friends in your class. You'll also go ahead and add like where an eye is or where a wing ends, but we're not going to draw in individual feathers right now because there's no sense in that. A collage is where we're gluing down paper on top of this and it's going to cover it all anyway. So once you get the basic shape of your bird down, so I've got him filling the page really big, I'm going to go ahead and add the legs to mine. We are going to focus on where colors shift and change into other colors. So get your basic shape of your bird on your paper. Again, if you need to pause the video, you can. And then what we're really going to pay attention to is where the colors change, because that's where we're going to change the type of paper that we're using in our collage, maybe something with a different color or a different texture. So when I look at the picture, I notice that I can see some areas that are different colors. The first thing I notice is that there's a lot of black right here along the back of his head and his neck. So on my sketch, I am going to go ahead and I'm going to draw in or sketch in a line that's going to make that shift where that black color begins and ends. So wherever I see the shape here on my big picture, I'm sketching it in here. And of course I'm using light pressure because I have already found a little area that I want to make a little thinner. So I'm going to do that now by erasing. And then after I've got that little black shape sketched in there on the back of his neck, I'm going to look and say to myself, where else do I see color shifting? I noticed that right here behind his beak I see some orange, like an orange shape. So I'm going to sketch in that orange shape now so that I can use a different color and texture of paper to represent that when I get ready to glue my collage down. I noticed that around his eye I can see some light orange, so I'm going to kind of make a circle around his eye where I notice the color changes there. And the other major area that I can see a color shift is here on the back. That kind of marks where his wing begins and it ends. So again, I'm not drawing individual feathers, but I am just going to go in and sketch the shape of that wing there on the bird's back, as I might fill that space in with another color or texture, as I mentioned before. Now, we don't really have to worry about the background right now or adding a horizon line or anything like that. We're really just going to focus first on the actual bird that you've chosen. So once you've got it sketched and you've got your colors blocked in, just little lines where the colors are going to change, we're going to start having fun with our box full of papers. So I want you to keep this on hand because that's going to be our reference as we're working. But we're going to be cutting and tearing all of these different fun papers that we found and collected and placing them here on the picture. Now, when we do a collage, we will eventually be gluing all this paper down, but I always recommend that you first start by just laying the papers out, because you might decide that you want to move something or swap something out, and it's easier to do if you haven't glued it down. So you are going to take your texture rubbing papers that we created. I've got some little mulberry kind of tissuey thin papers here. Again, I've got some newspaper and some sheet music and some different scrapbook papers. And these I love. I've just torn out color swatches from different magazine pages that will give me some different texture. So you are going to begin with some of the larger areas of your bird, and you're going to cut or tear, or a combination of two, your paper to fill in that area. So for instance, I'm going to start with the wing that's on my bird because that's a big broad area, and I'm going to choose. Now I'm going to work kind of in a little more realistic of the colors, which are lots of earth tones. But if you decide you really want your pelican to be pink and purple and you can make that happen, then go for it because you're the artist. So I'm going to begin by finding some paper that I know I have enough of to color this size shape that I'm shooting for here on the wing that can kind of represent that wing texture a little bit. So he's got some very small, I see really small feathers on the wing that look smaller than the ones on his back. So I'm going to look for something with just kind of a little bit more of a fine texture. And I think we're going to use this one texture rubbing that I made that has some kind of purple and brown on it. And you want to kind of tear it into the shape that you're working with here. Some people like to lay it on top and sketch the shape out and go back and cut, and that is totally fine, and that's another way to do it. I like the way it looks when you've got torn paper. It just gives it sort of a jagged edge, and I'll show you here an example of one that's finished. And I want you to notice how along all of the edges the paper has just sort of been torn, and it kind of gives it a little more of like an impressionist kind of look there. But some artists like to cut all of the little shapes out. But our goal today is going to be to cover this entire paper, all the white spots of this paper, up with some different colored papers and textured papers that we've created. So especially like here along the edge of the wing, I want to make sure that I'm tearing it to get kind of that jagged kind of wing shape that I can see here. So as you can see, I've torn this piece of paper sort of in the shape of the wing that's going to go there on my bird, and I'm not gluing it down because, again, I'm going to wait till I get a lot more kind of laid out before I commit and glue it down. The next thing I'm going to do is work with the rest of his body, his back and his underbelly. So I'm going to choose a different paper to work with this time, something that might complement his back and his underbelly. I think I'm going to choose this bit of scrapbook paper. It was like a little beach scene here, and I'm going to start tearing out some shapes that I can put down. I do not recommend you tearing tiny itty bitty little shapes right now because it will take you way too long to complete this project. But if you can get the basic shapes of your bird laid out now, you can go back and make some small shapes later to add little bits of detail that you want. So right now I'm focusing on broad shapes, large body parts. Again, the second shape that I've made for his back is really big, and then you can go back later and add others if you want that are a little more detail oriented. So I'm going to tear out sort of what I think is sort of his belly shape next and fill that in. And there really is no wrong way to do this. There's no wrong choice of paper. You're just going to sort of make sure that each time the color or the texture changes in your bird, that you are also changing the color and texture of your paper. It doesn't have to mimic it 100%, just something different than the space before. So I am already, with just 3 pieces of paper here, I'm already able to cover most of his back and his wing there. So I'm going to start working up his neck. Again, I'm working with large shapes still. And I notice again there's that black space that's on his neck. So I don't want to choose black, but I've got this really dark kind of swatch of magazine paper that I tore out. And so I am going to tear it into the shape of that black space on the back of his neck that I noticed was the darkest part of the picture. And I'm going to go ahead and lay that out because that's one of the distinct characteristics of the bird I'm working with, is that black patch along the back of his neck. So go ahead and finish cutting out and tearing out your papers so that you have filled your bird up. You want to make sure at the end you want to capture the legs and the eye and the beak and all of those shapes. And once you've got things kind of laid out, join me back here, restart the video, and we'll talk about how we're going to put these together with our glue and how we're going to work on the background and some more details. Now that I have paper cut and torn to fill in the basic shape of my bird and all of its main body parts, I'm going to go ahead and start gluing these papers down. So I'm going to take my glue stick and I'm going to work from the paper that is in the behind to the paper that's in front. So I might need to move some things. For instance, I need to move this piece that represents the wing that was on top over to the side so that I can get to the paper that was going to represent the body underneath. Now, the important thing about collaging is that you really glue your pieces down well. So you want to make sure that your glue goes all the way to the edges. The one thing that really kind of separates a good-looking collage from a very messy collage is whether or not you've glued your papers down well. So craftsmanship really comes into play when we're working with collage. So now that I've got the entire surface of the paper covered with glue, I can go ahead and start pressing down my first few pieces of my collage. I'm going to work on my large shapes first, and then I'll work my way toward the front with the smaller bits of details. Go ahead now and glue down all of the major parts of your bird, and then we'll come back and talk about some details and the background. Now that I've had an opportunity to glue down all of the pieces to make up my collage of my bird here in the center of the paper, I'm going to talk about the background just a bit. Now, you may choose to do a horizon line and show your animal in its habitat. For instance, in this example, we can see the line where the sky meets the ocean, meets the sand, and this artist has chosen to do the sky with some different papers in the blues and cool colors and some kind of neutral colors at the bottom for the sand. You can do that if your bird lives along the shorelines. Or you can just make it a little more vague. You may just choose one color that you want to collage some papers into the background. The only thing that I strongly recommend is that you use more than one paper for the background. So for my example, I've chosen to use all different sorts of blues for my background. Again, I just wanted to kind of make the bird stand out by having one color in the background, but I've got lots of different blue papers here that I'm going to work with. So I went back through my magazines and I found some more little swatches of color where I could find some blue. And for mine, I am going to work, I noticed in my inspiration photo that it's sort of different shades of light and dark that are kind of blurry there in the background. So for mine, I am going to work with my darker colors gradually turning to my lighter colors. So I'm going to take my paper and I'm going to tear it into larger chunks this time because I'm really just trying to fill broad spaces. And then I'm going to start sorting the colors from light to dark. So I've got some dark and some medium blues. And then I also have some areas here where I have some lighter color blues. And I'm going to make it go sort of an ombre effect from my dark blue through my medium blues to my light blue. And I'm going to choose to put my darker colors at the bottom of my page and my lighter colors at the top. So as I start to tear paper to go down here towards the bottom of my pelican picture, it's okay if your papers kind of hang off the edge while you're doing the background because you can go back and trim those with scissors. Or if you have a piece that has a natural straight edge like this one, I may choose to go ahead and use that as a corner piece. Now, as you get to the areas where your bird is, you have two choices. You can either tear it, again, if you're going with the torn look. I sort of have a combination of cutting and tearing here in my collage, and so I'm going to do the same technique for the back. I'm actually going to kind of cut out around where I need it to fit for the tail. So as I lay my paper here, I'm going to take my scissors and just kind of impromptu cut right around the areas where my bird's tail is so that it fills in that space. I can go back later with crayon or oil pastel if I need to get any tiny little details covered that are white paper showing, but that's a good way to just get kind of the beginnings of it. I've also got an area here where the rock is that my pelican's standing on, so I'm just going to cut that little space away. And you're just going to sort of work again with overlapping slightly your papers. I've got a little area I need to fill here. I can use this little scrap for that. And before we start gluing, of course, we're just going to begin by laying down the papers in the shapes that we think we need them in until we get a good bit of it committed, and then we can go back and start gluing after that. So I'm going to get my corners done here first. And once I get going a little ways up the paper, I can kind of start gluing, but make sure that you get it to where it's fitting around your bird the way you like it before you start gluing. After I've worked with this really dark color for a little bit, I am going to go ahead and switch over to a lighter shade of blue. As I mentioned, as I move up the paper, I want it to go kind of from dark to light blue. just to give the impression that maybe there is an ocean back there in the background behind my bird, but I do want the bird to be the focal point that everybody looks at. So it's important not to put more detail in the background than you did on your bird. So I'm going to go ahead and start tearing and cutting and gluing my blues into my background here, and I'm going to go all the way up to the top. Again, you may choose if you want a horizon line or just have one color filling in your background. Make sure again you're using a variety of papers, and then we'll get out our oil pastels or markers or crayons, and we'll talk about ways that you might want to add details to it. So now I've had a chance to go back and fill in my entire background with a variety of blue torn papers. Again, as I mentioned, I was doing a gradation where I was starting with darker blues and working my way to the top. You may find that your artwork is all finished now, but I want you to go back and make sure that all of your corners of the little shreds of paper are glued down well. Remember, that's kind of what makes good craftsmanship in our collage, is that all the little edges of the paper are glued down and not flopping up. So hold your paper up and do a little double check, add any dabs of glue that you might need to. The very last thing that you might want to do to your collage, again, you don't have to, but you might want to go back and add some more texture, or you might find that it needs a little bit more detail or shading, and you can go back and do that with crayons or oil pastels. You might even want to take some of your textures and go back under. Let's say you had a background that didn't end up with a lot of interest in it. You could put your textured papers underneath your collage now, and if it's something with a high relief and a lot of texture, it will actually show up if you go back with your crayons and rub back on top of your collage to add additional texture to different body parts for your bird or for your background. If you want to add any shading or highlights, you can do that. I could even take like a white oil pastel if I feel like I really want to catch some more highlights along the back of my bird. I can do that with a crayon or an oil pastel that's white. And likewise, if you feel like you need any shading, I was able to kind of get some shading with dark papers under the belly of the bird, but you could do that also with your oil pastels or crayons if you wanted. And then, of course, the last thing that you have to do is sign your artwork. So you can take a pencil or a black Sharpie, and at the bottom of your artwork, give it your best artist signature. I hope you enjoyed your collage lesson today with shorebirds and seabirds from the coast of South Carolina. And if you want to join us for one of these other videos, we would love to have you. We're doing lots of different projects with different mediums that you can learn about and use in your artwork going forward. Thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye.